Today, my speech is about the deficit and the debt and the financial problems that we face. But at the same time of that, we must never take our eyes off the need for building strong and sustained economic growth in Britain, growth in which our universities, and perhaps the Open University in particular, should play a huge part. As you say, the knowledge-based economy is the economy of the future, and in building that economy and recognizing it's not just about young people's skills, but people's skills all through their lives, the Open University has a huge role to play. A great British innovation and invention, and a privilege to be here this morning. Now, I've been in office for a month, and I've spent much of that time discussing with the Chancellor, with government officials, the most urgent issue facing Britain today, and that is our massive deficit and our growing debt. How we deal with these things will affect our economy and our society, indeed our whole way of life. The decisions we make will affect every single person in this country, and the effects of those decisions will stay with us for years, perhaps even decades to come. And it's precisely because these decisions are so momentous, because they will have such enormous implications, and because we cannot afford either to duck them or to get them wrong, that I want to make sure we go about the urgent task of cutting our deficit in a way that is open, responsible, and fair. I want this government to carry out Britain's unavoidable deficit reduction plan in a way that tries to strengthen and unite our country at the same time. I have said before that as we deal with the debt crisis, we must take the whole country with us, and I mean it. George Osborne has said that our plans to cut the deficit must be based on the belief that we are all in this together, and he means it. Tomorrow, George Osborne and Danny Alexander will publish the framework for this year's spending review. They will explain the principles that will underpin our approach and the process we intend to follow, including, vitally, a process to engage and involve the whole country in the difficult decisions that will have to be taken. But today, I want to set out for the country the big arguments that form the background to the inevitably painful times that lie ahead of us. Why we need to do this, why the overall scale of the problem is even worse than we thought, and why its potential consequences and the consequences of inaction are therefore more critical than we originally feared. There are three simple reasons why we have to deal with the country's debts. One, the more the government borrows, the more it has to repay. The more it has to repay, the more lenders worry about getting their money back. And the more lenders start to worry, the less confidence there is in our economy. Two, investors, people lending us this money, they don't have to put their money in Britain. They will only do so if they are confident that the economy is being run properly. And if confidence in our economy is hit, we run the risk of higher interest rates. Three, and the real human everyday reason that this is the most urgent problem facing Britain, is that higher interest rates hurt every family and every business in our land. They mean higher mortgage rates and lower employment. They mean that instead of your taxes going to pay for the things we all want, like schools and hospitals and police, your money, the money you work so hard for, is going on paying the interest on our national debt. That's why we have to do something about this. The argument that we've consistently made for urgent action to start tackling the deficit this year and an accelerated plan for eliminating it over the years ahead has already been backed by the Bank of England and the Treasury's own analysis. It has been made more urgent still by the sovereign debt crisis in the Eurozone over recent months. The global financial markets are no longer focusing simply on the financial position of the banks. They want to know that the governments that have supported the banks over the last 18 months are taking the actions to bring their own finances under control. And this weekend in South Korea, George Osborne received explicit backing from the G20 for the actions this government has already taken. Around the world, people and their governments are waking up to the dangers of not dealing with their debts. And Britain has got to be part of that international mainstream as well. So we're clear about what we must do. We've also been clear about how we must do it. As the Deputy Prime Minister has said, in a way that protects the poorest and the most vulnerable in our society, in a way that unites the country rather than divides it, and in a way that demonstrates that we're all in this together. And we should be clear, too, that these problems have not just appeared overnight. I think people understand by now that the debt crisis is the legacy of the last government. But exactly the same, I believe, applies to the action we will need to take to deal with it. If there are cuts, they are part of that legacy. And now that we've had a chance to look at what's really been going on, I want to tell you the scale of the problem that we face. Now, we've known for a long time that our debts are huge. Last year, our budget deficit was the largest in our peacetime history. This year, at least according to the previous government forecasts, it is set to be over 11% of our GDP, of our whole national income. Today, our national debt stands at £770 billion. Within just 5 years, it is set to nearly double, to £1.4 trillion. To put it in perspective, that is some £22,000 for every man, woman and child in our country. Now, we knew this before. Soon, the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility will set out independent forecasts that will show the scale of the problem we're in today. For the first time, people will be able to see a really, truly independent assessment of the nation's finances and the size of the structural deficit. This important innovation has been noticed around the world and I believe will help restore confidence in our fiscal framework. But what I can tell you today, and what we did not know for sure before, in fact what we could not know because the previous Chancellor of the Exchequer did not make the figures available, is how much the interest on our debt is likely to increase in the years to come. Now, we've looked at the figures, and based on the calculations of the last government, in 5 years' time, the interest we're paying on our debt, the interest alone, not the debt itself, just the interest we're paying on that debt, is predicted to be around £70 billion. That is a simply staggering amount. No wonder the previous government refused to publish this piece of information. Let me explain what it means. Today, we spend more on debt interest than we do on running our schools. But £70 billion means spending more on debt interest than we currently do on running our schools in England, plus on combating climate change, plus everything we spend on transport. Interest payments of £70 billion mean that for every single pound you raise in tax, 10 pence would be spent on the interest on our debt. Not paying off the debt itself, just paying the interest on the debt. Is that what people work so hard for? That their hard-earned taxes are blown on interest payments on the national debt? Think about it another way. Corporation tax raises £36 billion a year. So all the money from all the tax on all the profits of every single company in Britain just pays a little bit more than half of the interest on our national debt. That is how serious this problem is. What a terrible, terrible waste of money. So that's how bad things are. This is how far we've been living beyond our means. That is the legacy that our generation threatens to leave the next unless we act. So no one can deny the scale of the problem and that the scale is huge. But what makes this such a monumental challenge is the nature of the problem. Now, there are some who say that our massive deficit is just because we've been in a recession and that when growth comes back, everything will somehow be okay. But there is a flaw in this argument, and it is rather a major flaw, because we had a significant deficit problem